The price of a domestic gas cylinder was increased by 195 rupees. Due to the price hike of fuel since the 20th of this month, bus fares increased by a further 4% and the fees charged by school vans increased by 5%. In addition, the prices of food and drinks at restaurants will be increased in line with the gas price hike. Newsfirst spoke to several members of the public in the financial hub in Colombo for their thoughts.
It's on the collapse. I don't know how they are going to revive it. We look forward for better response from the government, which I don't get.
Right now there is no investment coming in to Sri Lanka. If you talk about stock market, people are taking money out from the stock market.
Speaking to Newsfirst, Professor Sirimala Beratna explained why the situation is taking place in Sri Lanka.
Using foreign reserves is not an option. Second option would be the import controls, and Sri Lanka is already categorized as not a conducive open economy for foreign investment and economic growth. So that in that case also Sri Lanka has very limited options to introduce further import controls. So it is also not an option. So which means actually if we allow the exchange rate to depreciate, we will achieve the same results that we expect through import controls through depreciating exchange rate.
We welcome foreign direct investment from anywhere, certainly from China. But when it involves giving contracts to China, borrowing huge sums of money from China, and the contract goes to China, and China contractors prefer to use their own workers from China, use everything imported from China. And even the payment is not made here, it's made in China. So we gain nothing at all. That kind of contract is not something that I welcome. The other thing is that they develop whole cities, very sophisticated cities, very expensive cities, which Malaysians cannot buy. So they are going to bring foreigners to live in those cities.
The statement made by the Malaysian Prime Minister must be taken very seriously, especially by those who bring in Chinese investment to Sri Lanka. The reason being, Sri Lanka cannot allow substandard products flooding its economy. China's Belt and Road Initiative has been the subject of concern as a number of countries which received investment under the program have begun to grumble about falling prey to a Chinese debt trap. Chinese projects in Sri Lanka have drawn similar concerns. Last year, the strategic Hambantota port was given to the Chinese on a 99-year lease over the country's inability to repay the loans obtained for the $1.4 billion project. Speaking to Newsfirst recently, former advisor to the Finance Minister Malik Kader stressed on Sri Lankan concerns.
For instance, one good example is to take the Hambantota port. Recently, there was a conversion from debt to equity, right? A 1.5 billion conversion. And if Sri Lanka's total debt was in the range of 50 billion, if the 10% they're talking about is 4 billion, at the 1.5 billion, you're looking at about close to about 6 billion. So that's about a 15%. So there are much more than this which is there. So this 10% which has been mentioned by China is, I think, inaccurate.
What sort of investments should a country attract? Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, in his interview in June, made it clear.
And we welcome investment, foreign investment from any country, so long as they bring in the capital, they bring in the technology, they set up plants here, and they employ Malaysians from workers to engineers, and they produce goods for the domestic market and for export. That we welcome, coming from anywhere.
It must be noted that it is totally unacceptable that measures have been taken to strike a blow on local employment by cutting out the cess tax and putting the local economy at risk.
Very good evening and welcome to Biz First Review 360. The country gender assessment report of the agriculture and rural sector of Sri Lanka, conducted by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, also known as FAO. To discuss regarding this, we've got in our studios Miss Nina Bangstrup, the FAO representative for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Also with us today is Miss Clara Park, the General Officer of the FAO Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. A very good evening and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
First question, out to you, Nina. What was the objective of compiling this report?
The objective really is to provide a snapshot of how men and women in Sri Lanka interact in the agricultural and rural sectors. How do they contribute to the sectors and how do they benefit? And particularly trying to see whether there are inequalities in the way that men and women benefit from the sector. And I want to clarify that when we talk about agriculture and rural sectors, what we really mean is the food crops and the cash crops, the spices, the coconuts, livestock, fisheries, and the forestry. So it's a very broad field. It's essentially dealing with how men and women interact in everything that has to do with things growing out of the earth or animals or fish.
So how does this report contribute to the development of the country?
Well, in the longer run, we hope that it will help to address inequalities in the way that men and women, as I was mentioning, benefit from their production and their efforts. But let's say in the slightly shorter term, we are hoping that this report will help all the decision makers in Sri Lanka to better understand how their programs and interventions can be better targeted to address some of the inequalities. For FAO particularly, we will be looking to see how our interventions, how our activities can be tweaked so that we are providing a bigger push towards better equality between the genders. And lastly, we are also very much hoping that other development partners in Sri Lanka will read the report and also learn from it how they can improve the way that their activities are designed so that we reduce the inequalities and certainly do not contribute to making them bigger.
Clara, next question out to you. Why is it important to integrate gender equality in the agricultural sector of the country?
Well, Nina already pointed to some of the key issues. So when we will have half of the agricultural labor force, or nearly half of the agricultural labor force, which is made of women, not addressing gender and not giving women and men the same opportunity to reach their full productive potential has huge implications, not only in terms of the benefit that people can gain out of their engagement in agriculture, but also in terms of the country economy. So a few years ago, FAO conducted a global study which showed clearly that only by bridging the gender gap in agriculture, thereby providing equal opportunities and equal access to women and men in agriculture, yields will grow by 2.5 to 4% globally, and the number of malnourished people globally would also decrease by 12 to 17%. So those are really meaningful statistics, no?
Definitely. You're watching Biz First Review 360. We are conducting a discussion regarding the country gender assessment of the agriculture and rural sector in Sri Lanka conducted by the Food and Agricultural Organizations of the United Nations. We will cross over to a short commercial break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back on the other side. Welcome back. You're watching Biz First Review 360. Now we are in discussion regarding the report on the country gender assessment of the agricultural and rural sector of Sri Lanka conducted by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, also known as FAO. Getting back to our discussion, ladies, Nina, I'd like to ask you, what are the main gender gaps here in Sri Lanka?
Thank you for that question. Yes, indeed, the assessment has shown that there are four main gaps. The first I would mention is the access that women have to productive resources, in particular land. Land is kind of the opening for many other resources, including credit, including water, technical advice from extension officers, and very many other productive assets are conditioned upon having a title, a deed to land, and many women in Sri Lanka do not have a deed to the land that they are actually cultivating. So this is a very major gap. Another gap is that women tend to be unskilled. Even though they are very knowledgeable about their agricultural production, they're considered to be unskilled, and therefore they receive less pay than men. So female agricultural laborers are significantly less paid than their male counterparts. Another gap is the ability of women to participate in decision-making processes. Many farmers' organizations do not include women, or there is segregation between the men and the women. They each have their own organizations, and it tends to be the men who decide. The big ticket decisions are taken by the men, and the women are not really able to participate in that. We have also noticed, and this is also a major gap, that in what we call the value chains, so in the different production lines, whether it's dairy or vegetables or any other commodity that is produced, that the women tend to be engaged at the initial stages. And this is where there is less ability to make a significant income. The real income comes later in doing the processing, doing the marketing, the negotiations with buyers and so on. That's where the real profits in agriculture and food production, cash production is done. The women tend not to be involved in that. They're involved at the very early stages, at the very initial processing, at the cleaning and of crops and so on. And they don't make a lot of money there. So this is another gap where the men get, let's say, the lion's share of the benefits from the agriculture.
Does the report include any recommendations to address these issues that you pointed out?
Yes, it includes a number of recommendations. I mean, firstly, the gender needs to be mainstreamed into the policies, the programs of the government. Because it is that is really the only way that we can start to address some of these inequalities, so that the land issue is addressed, the structure of farmers' organizations is addressed in a manner that would empower the women. We also need to look at technology and how women can access technology, how they can use it. As you may know, many agricultural machines are only used by men. The women do not get trained in using these machines, and very often they are too heavy, too cumbersome, too big for the women to use. And this is another aspect that needs to be really carefully looked at, so that the women can, become more professional in their agriculture. And I'm sure Clara will have things to add, but another recommendation of the assessment is to look again at the institutional constraints that women are facing, and that is preventing gender from really becoming, let's say, a mainstreamed feature that encompasses everything that happens in the agricultural sector, and particularly we know that there is an ambition in all ministries to have gender focal points. This needs to be further strengthened. They need to be further strengthened because we consider that they are not playing the full role that they need to play, and that would really make a significant difference to how gender is being considered in the key ministries dealing with agriculture. Another thing that needs to be addressed from a more institutional perspective is the shortage of data. There is not enough sex disaggregated data on
the agricultural sector.
Within the agricultural sector. There is a lot on education and health, but within the agricultural sector there is very little. And the absence of this data means that getting enough information to have a very precise view on what this current situation is very difficult. The assessment is qualitative. It doesn't go into statistics because the data simply isn't there. So this needs to happen, because without this sex disaggregated data, we also cannot measure whether the things that we're all doing, that the government is doing, that we are doing, that everyone is doing, whether it actually makes a difference. We have to be able to measure the difference between now and next year and 5 years from now. So that is also a very important feature.
Clara, I'd like to direct this question to you now. If this is the current prevailing situation here in Sri Lanka, in the agricultural sector more specifically here in Sri Lanka, What is preventing us from moving forward?
Well, Nina already mentioned some of the, let's say, institutional barrier, but I would say that one key stumbling factor still, this is true not only in Sri Lanka but worldwide, is the attitude and the culture that goes with some of these inequalities. So we really need to be focusing on changing the way in which we think, and that is true at all levels of society, not only at the institutional level, but starting from children when they're very young. Because for change to really happen, we really need to be thinking differently. And what I mean by that is that realizing that some of the gender roles that we see sometimes women are relegated to, they're not really due to differences in sex, so determined by whether someone is a man or a woman, but they're more coming from social constructs. So the issue that Nina mentioned before, for instance, women being underpaid and undervalued, that is one key example of that. So sometimes women themselves, they do not consider themselves as full farmers, no? They tend to see their work as an extension of the domestic work.
They don't see them as equals as men.
Exactly. And that obviously has implications, and it also has implication in terms of hiring managers, perceiving women's worth. So we really need to change more society broadly and really be thinking out of the box. And in order to do this, we also need very high political will. We have overarching framework, the SDGs, that tells us, that commits all of us to really leaving no one behind. We have an SDG 5, which focuses on women's and girls' empowerment. So I think we have all the instruments and also the will to get there. So we really have a lot of work to do.
Thank you very much, Nina. Thank you very much, Clara, for joining us this evening and sharing your expert opinion on the subject. We will cross over to a short commercial break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back on the other side. We are in discussion with Ajit Kanagasundram, the author of A Tale of Two Countries, the two countries being Sri Lanka and Singapore. Speaking about Sri Lanka and Singapore, one thing that just crosses my mind is the Singapore-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement. So what's your take on this?
It's an extremely good agreement. We need foreign investment. We need foreign expertise. We need foreign management. We therefore need free trade agreements, not only with Singapore. We should negotiate the economic and trade and commercial agreement with India, EDCA, Pakistan, Thailand, whatever we can do. Because without external help, we will not be able to progress. We will not be able to provide our youth with decent jobs. What do youth do today? The boys become security guards or three-wheeler drivers, dead-end jobs. The girls go to the Middle East where they are sexually and physically abused to work as housemaids. I mean, we are the only country that does it, Bangladesh and Pakistan, much poorer than us. They don't send their women to the Middle East to be abused, right? And otherwise, they work as they work as hairdressers in salons here, and they moonlight as hostesses to supplement their income. Disgraceful situation. We can't live by exploiting our women, right? So the free trade agreement is an extremely good step forward. In fact, I personally, because of the free trade agreement, I've been approached by a Chinese multi-billionaire called Sunny Wu, who wants to invest in a car production facility in Sri Lanka, electric cars, for export to India, Singapore and Pakistan. Because of this free trade agreement, we should be able to provide 3,000 people with employment within 5 years.
So I believe the general consensus is not against free trade agreements as a whole. It was the manner in which this was formulated, the manner in which it was signed.
It had to be done that way. The people elected the government. The job of the government is to govern, to lead, not to go back and ask people every question. And particularly in our case, if they had had proper consultation, our trade unions, our professional unions, like the GMOA, would have sabotaged it. What does the GMOA have to do with a free trade agreement? They should be there looking after the welfare of their patients, but they go on strike for the slightest opportunity for things that have nothing to do with medicine or with health services. So the government did what it had to do. I hope they will continue to do it and continue to ignore Luddites like the GMOA and the other trade unions.
But I believe a main concern that the Sri Lankan general public, the trade unions have, is the massive amount of corruption, which is, I believe, not prevalent in Singapore.
Absolutely not.
So, speaking about corruption, one thing that obviously crosses all of our minds is the central bank bond scam. And something tells me that you have a very interesting story.
Yes, I must say, first let me put the bond scam into perspective. It's the worst thing that happened under the present UNP government, but in terms
Some people say it's the worst thing that happened, period.
No. It is 10 times less than what happened in corruption in Lanka, in building highways, in building Hambantota, in building the power plant under the previous regime. In monetary terms, it's 10 times less. But in terms of impact, in terms of publicity, the biggest. Actually, I happen to know Arjuna Mahendran quite well. He used to work for me in the central bank, in the computer department. What do I think of him? Very smart, very hardworking, very energetic. He did the foundation work for the automated clearinghouse. But even at that time, it became obvious he was a I later got to know him very well in Singapore. He's a personal friend. He advised me on my personal investments, but he was always looking for shortcuts, right? And I'm not surprised at what happened. The balance to this is that our present government, Indrajit Kumaraswamy, is not only technically superb, but he is a gentleman and 100% honest. So I think in balance, the UNP have counterbalanced the disastrous appointment of Arjuna with the correct appointment of Indrajit Kumaraswamy, who also happens to be a dear friend of mine.
But is there any way to undo the effect of the central bank bond scam, the impact it has
Well,
had
they have frozen their assets of perpetual treasuries, a few billion rupees, so they can recover part of it. Whether they will ever recover Arjuna Mahendran, that's a big question. By the way, he's not hiding in Singapore. He's openly seen in clubs and things like that. I haven't met him personally, but friends of mine have.
Okay, so that's privileged information. Moving on, sir, back to the book. What do you plan on doing with this book?
First of all, let me tell you, all the proceeds from the sale of this book will go to a fund for war widows on both sides, the Sinhala war widows and the Tamil war widows, because they are the true victims of our failure to govern ourselves with justice and compassion since independence. So I want to help them. I want to create a national dialogue. I mean, our papers are interesting but full of political trivia. I want people to think back on what is fundamentally required to develop this country. For example, we need to sacrifice. I mean, Singapore, 30 years the government asked for sacrifice, and what they said was, you sacrifice your present living standards for us, and we will give your children and grandchildren a better life. And the people trusted the PAP government to do that. Similarly, there are no easy ways out. This government offered a 10,000 rupees salary increase to every public servant. You can't do things like that. You have to tell them, we are going to tax you more, you are going to have to work harder, you will have less holidays, and maybe your children will have a better life.
But on the flip side of that, the situation in Sri Lanka is that you can see the politicians, their children, their families, their close relatives, their living standard keeps soaring over the roof, while the rest of the country just goes down the gutter.
I know, that's the problem. That's the problem. You put your
So there is an issue of trust.
Yes, there is no trust. And both sides are equally bad. No, actually, I'm sorry. Both sides are not equal. Both sides are equal, are not so bad. I exaggerated. At least under this government, there are no white van abductions and murders. And except for the central bank bond scandal, there will be very little corruption. So I think we are better off. But still, are we anywhere near Singapore? The answer is no.
So there you have it from the author of A Tale of Two Countries, Ajit Kanakasundaram. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us this evening and sharing your perspective.
Thank you. My book is on sale at the BMICH Book Fair. Please buy a copy. As I said, the proceeds will go to a War Widows Fund. Thank you.
And that's it from Biz First Review 360. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for watching us. Do tune in next time.